Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another BBA webinar. And this time we are back to talk about a very exciting topic, and that I think touches on all of us, and that's got to do with product innovation in the construction space, and specifically around adopting a new methodology or approach to how we innovate in the market when it comes to design and build, etc. My name is Katie Roberts, and I'm in the marketing team at the BBA. And today, as I said, we are discussing a topic, but although it's being recorded, we will make it possible for you to answer any questions or ask any questions rather. So if you have any queries that come up while you are watching this, please feel free to email them through to us at hello@bbacerts.co.uk, and we will do our best to get all of those answered and send them out to you as well once that is done. Just a bit of housekeeping. As I said, this will be available on our website within the next few days, and we'll be sure to send everyone a link to the video as well. If you want to share it or rewatch it on catch up. I'm not going to do any further introductions because I'm joined by a panel of absolute industry experts that are here to talk about the subject matter, which I am not as proficient to talk about. So I'm going to hand over to each of them to do their own introductions, if that's okay. And Andrew, if we can start with you, just tell us who you are and introduce yourself to the audience in a few seconds. Oh, I think Andrew may have frozen. Keith, let's start with you.
Good morning, Keith Waller. I'm the Programme Director for the Construction Innovation Hub, which is a programme being delivered through the construction sector deal as part of the industrial strategy. Perfect.
Thank you, Keith. Bill.
Good morning, everyone. Bill Hewlett. I'm the Technical Director of the BBA. I've been with the firm just over 2 years. Prior to that, I was with Costain for many years, most of my career. At BBA, we certify construction products. We have the Agreement certification. I'm sure everyone's heard of that. We also have installer schemes for many of our products, which we certify and validate the quality of the workmanship on site.
Perfect. Thank you. It appears we have lost Andrew for a second, but I'm sure he will join us as soon as the opportunity arises again. But I think we'll just kick straight off with the conversation at hand. And Bill, while we stay with you, we're talking about product innovation, and more specifically the challenges that the construction sector experiences in launching new products and solutions to market. So I wonder if we just start with setting the scene. What are the challenges we are talking about that potentially restrict the industry from moving forward in their deployment to market?
Thanks, Katie. So I'm going to talk really from the perspective of where we are today, and then I'm going to let Keith take the agenda forwards into where the product platform agenda takes us in short order, hopefully even before tomorrow. So taking that question, what are some typical problems with innovation? I'm going to start off by stealing a very simple mantra, if you like, that in order to make a product fly in the market, we need to have a solution that meets a need. There needs to be someone who wants to buy it, and there need to be people who are able to deliver it. Now, what we need to do then is to interpret that in the construction industry and how that affects things. So we can see here a fairly simple end-to-end chain from need to want to fulfillment, but just unpacking that a little bit. So products, building construction products, become parts of systems. So innovations, if we want to bring them to market, they have to fit into this system in which they're intended to be used. So that's geometrically, functionally, interfaces, joints, tolerances. They mustn't upset something else by interaction with that in some unexpected way. Delivery, and my little mantra I quoted talks a lot about people being able to deliver it, but that's not just about the manufacturer delivering it to market. It's about the designer designing it into the building. It's about the builder and their ability to integrate the product, buying it, handling it, fixing it. There's much about those people as it is about the manufacturer themselves. And then we get uncertainty on product volume of sales. So if we're selling a product, someone comes up with a new product into the market, what's the volume of sale they're going to achieve? Many of our buildings, most these days, are in effect one-offs. So what will be the level of demand? That can be quite a considerable uncertainty, particularly if you've got an innovative product. And then I could also talk about warranty, certification, compliance to standard. And if it's truly an innovation, the standards, of course, won't exist. It wouldn't if it's an innovation. So in short, it's quite a risky, complicated proposition or process to bring innovation to the construction market with its integration issues. It's more complicated than, for example, selling a self-contained product as you might find on a supermarket shelf or in a retail outlet of some sort. So those are some of the complications that we've got today in the market. And of course, BBA, we work with a lot of innovators, helping them bring their products to market and helping them through that journey. So that's how I see it.
Thanks, Bill. And Keith, if I jump across to you, so taking what Bill has said into account, we're talking about an approach that is quite different to how things have been done in the past. And we're talking about specifically adopting a product platform approach. In fact, some are even heralding it as the savior to the industry's innovation woes. So what is it? How does it address some of the challenges that we're seeing, and especially, in the ways to encourage appetite in adopting an alternative methodology?
Thanks, Katie. Well, I think that the construction sector and the construction industry at large is generally very good at innovating, but not necessarily in the way that we're talking about today. So currently, I think the industry is very good at innovating to find a better way of doing the same thing. And so the competitive market that the construction sector businesses operate in, really are we competing to find a better way of doing the same thing. And so we are using traditional skills, traditional methods, traditional products to try and differentiate ourselves from our competitors in that space. Product platforms offer a different approach, which is rather than just trying to do the same thing a better way, it's really a way to do a better thing. So it's looking at different processes to develop products, looking at the demand and the supply side here. So we're talking about ways of bringing new products in which aren't constrained by only being able to be used on one project, one tactical solution. What we're looking to do is to create a market, a strategic market for product platforms and kits of parts to be used on multiple different building types across multiple types of projects. And of course, going back to Bill's point, it's very difficult to build an investment case to develop a new product or a new solution if it has to pay back over one single project. If there is a long-term and stable demand for buildings, as we know from the government's pipeline, we're going to be building schools and homes and hospitals and social infrastructure of all types for many years to come. How do we look at that market in a more strategic way? How do we look at how we aggregate and standardize and rationalize the demand in a way that allows businesses to develop kits of parts, bring new products to market, go them through that certification and the standards that may support that in the longer term, so it can really drive a different way of delivering the built environment. And I'm really keen that we understand it's not just doing the same thing in a slightly different way. It really is something very different. We're talking about proper manufacturing processes to develop products that are interoperable, that are repeatable, that are reconfigurable, that can be used across multiple building types. And we're moving, therefore, quite a lot of the economic activity associated with construction away from the site itself and into that development, design, manufacturing and assembly things that can operate far away from the construction site itself. And if you look at some of the woes that the construction industry, some of the challenges it is currently facing, we're talking about the amount of waste that it creates, the inefficiency of those on-site processes, the shortage of skilled labour and general skills within the industry to deliver the demand that's required to meet our needs in the built environment. We're able to address some of those issues through a product platform approach because we're moving demand away. We're creating higher quality products. We're creating more sustainable solutions to operate more effectively. So it isn't just a different way of doing the same thing. Product platforms unlock a wholly new approach to how we deliver the built environment in a way that drives real productive growth, increases quality, increases safety, and delivers all of those ambitions we have for the built environment to contribute more to our society, to our economy, and to our environment. Really crucial step change. You said, I think in your question, Katie, about this is a game changer for the industry. It is, or has the potential to be, but it won't happen if we have every single client specifying things in a tactical short-term way, every designer creating something bespoke, and every contractor relying on historic processes and skills to deliver those buildings. We need a system-wide thinking and approach that unlocks the opportunities that a platform approach can deliver to the UK and beyond.
Thank you, Keith. And Bill, just picking up on what Keith said, specifically through the lens of the driving quality and safety through innovation, what does this approach mean in that world, in your opinion, Bill?
Well, the objective and the ambition clearly is to get far closer, if not to the level of quality and reliability and safety we see in other industries, perhaps most obviously the automotive industry or aerospace. And getting it right first time, every time, to a very high level of specification and tolerance. I think that the drivers where that will come from is in the clarity and completeness of the product specification and its alignment with the needs of the asset as a whole, or the building, the platform, the structure, however you want to frame that. And I think that clear and precise definition in regard to size, shape, fit up, tolerance and interfaces, all absolutely important. There's a common phrase we use: the devil lurks in the interface or in the interfaces. So really good fit up does matter, and you see that, a really nicely made car with margin around the doors, around the boot lid and so on, all absolutely spot on. That's the sort of thing we want to get to. I think we can add to that, clearly, as Keith articulated, a manufacturing environment. It's a clean, efficient environment. Products are designed for manufacture and assembly. You can have ergonomic design is improved, and the workspace can be more ergonomically designed, and there's more chance to iterate, so you can get progressive improvement from iteration. So those are also some key quality wins. Then safety, obviously DFMA, the process of design for manufacture assembly, that will help safety in production. We can get away from product substitution. If you're a bit short of doors down at Audi one day, you don't go and buy a few from Volvo. You stick with the doors that you should have, and you make sure your supply chain works. We saw at Grenfell in many places product substitution is a considerable ill that the industry has to deal with. So we'll get away from that, and that'll help the safety of the as constructed asset, quite apart from anything else. And then the fit up, again, coming back to that, things like smoke, flame, gaps, getting the details right do make a considerable contribution to the safety of the finished asset once it's built and in use. So I hope that sufficient grist for your mill, Katie.
It does. Thank you very much. And that brings me beautifully to Andrew. So Andrew, you just dropped out at the crucial point when everyone was introducing themselves. So before I ask you a question, just tell us, introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, Andrew.
Yeah, apologies for that. I blame PlusNet. They've been very unreliable recently. Something's clearly going wrong in the factory there. So I'm Andrew Crudgington. These days I'm an independent researcher and writer, and I do some work with the BBA, which led me to write a piece earlier this year. Well, the original brief was to look at innovation in the construction sector, and I became slightly depressed about seeing how many previous innovations that had been hyped considerably had come to very little over time. So I thought it'd be useful to take a different view and perhaps approach people who are driving innovation like Keith and get an insight from them, which I think has led us to this conversation today. In a previous life, I was, which I think is where your question is going to kind of come to, I was the director of policy at the Institution of Civil Engineers. And I guess that's really my background, the sort of policy and regulatory environment around construction.
Thank you. And on that note, you're absolutely right. I was going to target that. How do we, so looking at your policy and regulation background, how do we ensure that we have the right enabling environment for this platform approach, specifically in terms of policy and regulation? Yeah. What does Nirvana look like in being able to support and adopt, a brand new change or different way of doing things?
Yeah, I suppose there's a kind of, it's worth thinking about the policy and regulatory environment and then how it's applied and its enforcement. So, Keith alluded earlier to the size of the programme of work that's coming down from the public sector in social and economic infrastructure. So, if you think of government, well, government often describes itself as the single biggest construction client in the UK. I always think that's slightly misleading because, as my old politics prof told me, government's not a unitary actor, and there are sort of many construction clients in the public sector. And I guess that's part of the challenge that Keith faces, trying to secure that level of consistency across the piece. Now, in terms of what's government's doing at that kind of sort of macro level from the centre as a client, I think you have to say that I think they're doing a reasonable job. If I look over the last 20 or 30 years, they've really sort of moved the ante. So if you look at what the Infrastructure and Products Authority are doing, particularly with its construction playbook, which I guess is really a series of policies, standards, norms that apply to all government departments and arm's length bodies. So that's going to cover hospitals, schools, prisons, strategic road network, flood defences, etc., etc. So it has a construction playbook. It's set up on a comply or explain basis, so it is applied, and it does have a strong presumption in favour of MMC, modern methods of construction, and a strong steer to platform approach. I was rereading it again this morning in advance of this seminar, and I'd sort of recommend anyone having a look. And of course, it doesn't just do that in isolation. It doesn't just say, here's a WYSI technology. It also talks about some of the other supporting factors that Keith talked about. So it talks about the importance of clients managing in terms of pipelines and portfolios, and not individual projects, so that people can potentially invest for a market and not for a product. It talks about harmonisation, digitalisation, standardisation. It talks about early contractor engagements, all good stuff. And again, I think if you look at some of the other things government are doing as well, so for people like the government commercial function, I was having a look again this morning at some of their guidance around contracting for MMC and product platforms. I think that does quite a good job in explaining, again, echoing what Keith was saying, the difference between simply doing the same sort of thing a bit better and doing a bit more off-site fabrication, off-site construction, and doing something fundamentally different, contracting for a platform approach. So that's all good stuff. And I guess you have to applaud government for doing that. I'd probably ask a question back to Keith: is there's always an implementation deficit. So what's the sort of size of the implementation deficit we need to overcome? So because I guess when push comes to shove, that can always be tightened up. And I guess on a sort of second area I'm sort of interested in, and I'm probably not as excited as I would like to be, is I guess there's a sort of broader legislative and regulatory environment where government has a strong role to play. So this is the sort of day-to-day quotidian stuff where in different sectors there's kind of key documents like, I don't know, the design manual for roads and bridges. That's probably not a good example in this context, but those kind of documents, those kind of sort of biblical tracks, do shape how things are done in sectors. And I guess in different sectors they're going to get in the way or not, and I'm sort of interested in how much they are. And again, similarly, all things around local authority building control, DCOs, all that consenting approvals assurance type of process that needs to be slogged through, that does need to be aligned. And I'm guessing that there's some serious barriers there that still need to be overcome, but interested in Keith's view.
Yeah, Keith, before I come to you, Keith, would you like to just respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, I think Andrew's very fair in saying that the government has created what can broadly be seen as a fairly supportive policy and regulatory environment. And we've seen things like the construction playbook, and we've seen many of those long-standing government tools around things like the Green Book for economic appraisal and many others. The challenge, as Andrew rightly says, is not what the policy says, but how it is implemented. And part of the challenge is, whilst the Crown may be indivisible in law, it's not necessarily indivisible in the way it interacts with the market, the way it specifies, the way it procures, and the way it contracts. And I think there needs to be something that helps government and helps clients in the private sector as well to make better decisions, rather than just to revert to the status quo. So if you think buildings are essentially fairly complex, multi-dimensional functional assets, be they a hospital or a prison or a school or whatever, and really they're made currently with a series of very simple dumb elements, bricks, plasterboard, bit of cable, that then become complex and joined up on site, put together in a highly bespoke, highly variable way by experienced artisans on the construction side. And of course, as we start to move into think about what a platform approach might move, we're actually moving the creation of the complexity from the construction site into the factory, into the assembly facilities, where we're putting integrated, complex kits and parts and sub-assemblies together in a highly controlled, assured process where we have full material traceability, we understand everything. And the activity on site, rather than making it more complex, is just a very simple, repeatable connection of these assets using those common interfaces that Bill alluded to earlier. So the challenge then, if we want to get to that place and we understand the benefits that will deliver it economically, socially, environmentally, what are those things in terms of how that policy is interpreted and enacted through the individual clients, through those people who are providing assurance at a central government level? How do we make that happen at a faster pace and scale? Because we are also failing to unlock or failing to deliver on some of those wider benefits that such approach may deliver. So how are we considering the best whole life performance rather than the cheapest construction? How are we considering the relative merits of two approaches, where one is delivering sustainable manufacturing jobs in deprived areas of the UK, supporting those components and sub-assemblies that go into our buildings? How do we compare that with something that may be flat packed and imported from Southeast Asia? How are we making those value judgments in that space? So we need to provide the evidence that enables that to happen. And really, I think industry needs to be holding government's feet to the fire on that. Andrew talked about the policy having a sort of comply or explain. And quite frankly, I've seen evidence where a satisfactory explanation is, I couldn't be bothered to do it any differently, which to me is not necessarily, what the construction playbook is intended to do. That's not the ambition that government has set out in its policy. So we need to break down some of those cultural and behavioural barriers if we are to unlock the benefits. But I also think we need to do rather more on articulating the scale of benefit of getting down this utopian platform approach to how we deliver the majority of our schools, the majority of our homes, the majority of our hospitals in the future. I do not think, it is acceptable as a nation for us to be continuing to build things that we have to retrofit later on to meet our legal obligations, that aren't safe, either in the construction process or for those who are using and operating or living in those facilities. Well, it's unacceptable that we have the level of waste that we create in the industry at the moment, the level of disruption. And why are we putting up with that at the moment? And so I think there is a much better future, and we're not going to get there if people allow "I couldn't be bothered" as an acceptable excuse not to change. We need to have that demand side impetus and a bit more rigour applied to that. And we also need to keep that collaborative spirit going in industry to try and drive this forward, recognising a huge opportunity to deliver a much better built environment if we're taking on these processes and approaches that can make a difference.
Thank you, Keith. Bill, anything to add to that, to what Andrew and Keith have mentioned regarding the environment?
Yeah, that's been an extensive insight into process. I think that the piece I'd like to add to that is perhaps to challenge the question about regulation and warranty or insurance provision as a basis on which to provide built assets. So should they comply to, for example, the building regulations, or they must deliver that, but should they apply to the approved documents, I suppose, to be more accurate? Or if we go to a consideration almost of branding and say, well, if people are happy to put forward assets against a certain brand and take ownership of the risk that they're controlling by virtue of the quality of their design and design execution, then why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? Now, clearly, regulation is there to stop people taking risks that they didn't ought to be taking, even if they feel like taking it. Plus, of course, the building users or occupants in a residential building aren't the people who are necessarily building it and putting it into place. So you might say a developer is taking a risk on behalf of someone else. So you need to think that through. But I think there could be a different model here for authorising the use or the provision of assets into the built environment, and that does play to a different delivery system. And I think with a very few exceptions in the marketplace of the built environment, the concept of brand does not exist beyond the first sale of the building. There are a few around, some of the Arab buildings that have been put up very occasionally some of the built homes that people have got, but they tend to be rather at the prestige end of the market rather than the more commonplace. So I think that's what I would add.
Thank you. Keith, just coming back to you for a second around the rule book. So we're speaking about the platform approach, and which is synonymous with the rule book that's been set up. Just tell us in a few minutes, why was the rule book produced and what is it aiming to achieve?
Okay, so we produced the product platform rulebook, and as we sit here today, we're a couple of days away from publishing an update to it. But the reason for producing it in the first place is recognising there was quite a lot of activity already happening in off-site. So we saw volumetric manufacturers, we saw certain people producing elements and sub-assemblies that might fit in buildings, but they weren't necessarily configurable. They weren't necessarily interoperable, and they weren't really working to a common set of interface standards. So the reason behind producing the product platform rulebook and its publication, and even though I'm saying the Construction Innovation Hub published it, we did that with many hundreds of industry partners working alongside us. We wanted to do it with them rather than to them in that space. So the idea was, how do we get a more broader understanding of what product platforms are, the benefits that they might deliver, and how do we go about accelerating the speed of deployment and diffusion. So we set out a series of 8 rules around being deployable, configurable, common repeatable elements, the interfaces, the quality systems, the need to provide that structured info, and crucially for us, we wanted something that was open source and available for all. We didn't want to tie any clients down to a single proprietary system, and we also wanted to make sure that there was an element of circularity in the thinking of those elements. Could they be reconfigurable? And if you like, what part of the inspiration behind this in the early days was conversations we had with other sectors of the economy. So we spoke to people in automotive, we spoke to people in aerospace, trying to understand, how they'd addressed these issues to try and get sustainable distributed supply chains that could produce bits that would fit on different building types for different clients and so on moving forward. And of course, the example we often use is the conversation around aerospace and a Boeing 777, where there are 3 engine providers who service that Boeing plane, but Pratt & Whitney, Boeing and Rolls-Royce. And each of them has invested very heavily in the IP and the R&D associated with their particular engine. But they've been able to do that, confident there's a long-term pipeline, as Bill referred to earlier, and those common interface standards. So it's absolutely clear to all of those manufacturers how that engine must connect to the wing. It defines very clearly the fluids that need to cross that boundary, the data that needs to cross that boundary as well, allowing them to develop a product with confidence. And if you start taking that down from something as complex as a jet engine down to something more simple like a door set, I mean, the government buys about 1 million doors a year, and I'm sure it has at least 50,000 different types of door that it buys, which really seems unnecessary. So we're thinking with common interface standards, with common rules, we can start to rationalise and standardise to a greater level than we do at the moment, deliver some real benefits in terms of economies of scale, some efficiency gains, open up markets for businesses who want to manufacture into that space. And we did some analysis of the government's construction pipeline in a document we published a year or 2 ago called Defining the Need. And we looked at the forthcoming pipelines for schools, for hospitals, for prisons, and tried to understand how much of that was addressable in a platform world if we were configuring, specifying in the right way. And we reckon about 70% could be delivered by a platform approach. And obviously at the moment we're delivering nothing like 70%, because as Bill said at the start, we haven't set out our requirements in the same way. We haven't got that breadth and scale of products, and we haven't got the capability in industry. But if we're able to say, here is the benefit of getting to this utopia, and here we are now, we can start thinking about what are the steps we need to take collectively so we can accelerate those social benefits, those economic benefits, and those environmental benefits that will be unlocked if we can get this right.
So, Bill, just picking up on what Keith has just said, if we know about the theory, we move into putting it into practice. He's spoken about the clear need to see how we can visualize this in practice. Is it possible to conceive a standard building as a product platform, do you think? And in what ways can or can't it be done?
Okay, that's a
big question.
So, big question. I mean, I think the answer ultimately has to be no. Although I'm going to give it as a very qualified no, and I'll come back to I reach that conclusion. I think the feeling I've got is that buildings, they've got to be useful, they've got to be safe, they've got to be sustainable, suited to location, and so forth. But really, what we're looking here at in your question is the specific view on design freedom, I would say. So in order to meet those ends, how much freedom do you need? So buildings ultimately, and we like, we all love to design. We love the design challenge programs on the telly and so on, and they are expressions of free will and self. So you're kind of challenging that. But on the other hand, we see many generic forms of building, for example, blocks of flats, office, park buildings, that sort of thing. And having been a designer of such assets in my career, I'm well aware of the ways that we tried to standardize key aspects of those buildings. And at our best, I think it's fair to say that we did come up with something close to platform solutions. But we didn't call it a product platform at the time, and I guess we could have tried to do so. But I think it was a sort of an ad hoc product platform. And I think when I read the product platform rulebook, what I'm seeing is a much more disciplined approach than that. And there are certainly some further steps that should be taken if you want to truly achieve product platform status, if you want to call it so. There's a lot to learn from manufacturing industry and manufacturing technology in the rule book. For instance, reference there to the rules on how part count can be optimized. So, when should 2 parts be 1 part, and reduce the part count in the building. We certainly didn't go that far in the work that I was doing a few years ago at the time, although the solutions were fairly generic in their character. So I think in the marketplace at the moment, as we see it, you can get a long way down that road, but that's more about use of standard products and assembling them in standard ways. And it is truly to think about a product platform, which is a much more integrated perspective of view. And it's perhaps in that way that I would give you the answer no to your original question.
Okay, thank you for that. Andrew, I'm going to just come across to you for a second. If we just taking a step back to the environment, etc., and looking at the people that will be involved in delivering this or adopting this approach, what would you say are the blockers or resistance to taking this type of approach towards design and building?
It's interesting because just listening to kind of Keith and Bill, there's sort of clearly some sort of practical processy things that need to change, and those kind of things that sort of frame how the work is done. But it almost the way they're describing it, it almost feels like there's a sort of psychological, almost sort of sociological barriers to be overcome. So Keith talked about the need for the supply chain to hold government's feet to the fire, and traditionally in the construction industry, I've not really seen the supply chain being that willing to kind of turn around to its biggest clients and say, come on fellas, this isn't on, you've really got to look at things differently. So there's a kind of approach that needs to be taken to become more bullish there, and you do see that in some other sectors. You don't see IT technology industry barons being quite so supine as perhaps the construction industry has been. But I was really fascinated by what Bill just said as well about the designer and design as an expression of self and freedom. I'm not sure I do quite use those words, but I know what you mean. This is actually quite a kind of fundamental thing that people feel what it is I am as an engineering designer or a designer, what it is I'm doing and going into work. And trying to shift that is actually no mean feat. And again, did you come across resistance when you were trying to push that productization process you were talking about, Bill? Did you find designers pushing back on you this isn't what we do. This isn't what I am.
Well, yeah, maybe to take your word, Andrew, supine. Maybe my design team's a little more supine than others might have been, because they certainly came along with us, and you know, the checkbook's always a powerful negotiating tool, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think, you know, something to think about in that respect is what you know, how does a built environment really work? And it's not just about the buildings that are put in place, and the platform approach relates to individual buildings. So, you know, let's think about the scope for layout of, for example, office parks or space planning, streetscape, and so on. And one can still achieve a lot. I work, as it happens, I'm sitting in what I would describe as a very attractive office park, and the buildings are actually pretty much identical. They're cookie cutter, if nothing else. But the way they're disposed in the site and the way the landscaping is used, the soft landscaping, water features, and so on, is what makes the difference. It's not down to the buildings themselves. So there's a dimension there to look at. Secondly, I think it's fair to say, and certainly I've experienced this in work I've done, is constraint can drive creativity. And what can I achieve with a simple palette, if you like? You know, some of the greatest pictures and paintings ever been painted have been painted from quite a simple palette of material. So let's embrace the constraints and focus your innovation upon it. So my point here in the built environment, some very effective Scandinavian designs that, with no more than 10 or 20 components in the entire building, are really excellent and interesting buildings to see and to be in. I think, lastly, of course, platforms give some constraint, but equally the component set can be designed to be quite varied. And I think this is where the innovation at that level can be much more expressive. Because really what we're saying in a product platform is that the interface between products and the specification across the interface, as Keith was outlining, is what matters. But between, sort of within the interfaces, you can kind of do what you want, provided you don't affect what happens outside that, and you don't affect the overall utility of what you're making. So there's still plenty of scope for innovation in that regard. So I think, yeah, it takes the focus away from individual buildings, but then it can place the focus of innovation in other places.
And while we're on that, I want to jump across to Keith for a second. So we were talking blockers, resistance, but if we widen that a little bit more, Keith, firstly, do you have anything to add that either Andrew or Bill have said, but also specifically, how are the likes of planners, designers, so in other words, non-manufacturers, finance, insurance organizations, how are they adopting this approach, if at all? You know, what can you tell us about that part of the supply chain?
Well, I think it's a fairly mixed bag. But I just want to pick up just something on build on what Bill said earlier.
Sure.
We often have seen some confusion between innovation in design and just completely unnecessary bespoking in design. There was some analysis done by, I think it was Bryden Wood a few years ago, looking at how the Department for Education classrooms in their schools were being built, and of course their standard, their specification talks about, I think it's about a 55 square metre size of classroom is what is required in a secondary school. And they did some analysis of the actual classroom sizes that had been designed for their estate. And they found many, many hundreds of different sizes between about 53 and 60 metres. So that's not creativity, that's just bloody mindedness. You know, and that sort of unnecessary bespoking is quite often a barrier, a cultural barrier, physical barrier, an economic barrier to adopting more standard manufacturing solutions, because you can't develop products if they've got to pay back just on one project, on one classroom. So there's a real opportunity to stop unnecessary bespoking in that space. But equally, when you start going back to your question about where are, you know, outside the manufacturer space, where are there opportunities for improvement? So, you know, I think there's still a bit of education needs to be done within elements of the finance markets itself, certainly in terms of insurance, mortgages, and so on. Although, interestingly, we've seen a number of investors in the built environment, in the private sector, becoming quite interested in platform approaches, because if they're looking at their ESGs and they're looking at the opportunity for not being landed with stranded assets, looking at solutions that are more sustainable in terms of waste, more efficient in terms of energy use, more configurable in the future. There seems to be quite a push moving down that space. And we saw the same thing a dozen years or so ago when government set out its mandate for BIM, which basically said all centrally procured construction projects through the government departments should be level 2 BIM compliant by 2016. And actually, you know, that was an impetus not just for those public sector clients like education and justice and so on, but actually was really shifted the market in the private sector as well. So I think we'll see a lot of private sector interest in driving this agenda forward that may actually outpace some of the things that government is intending to do. However, you know, we still need to work out areas about, you know, how does this chime with the way that planners fulfill their duties and obligations at the moment? Are we going to be concerned if people are insisting in terms of planning conditions that local jobs are provided by the developer when actually it may be manufactured 30 miles away, you know, and how do we weight the lack of additionality of local jobs in that district against the wider benefits of a faster construction, a safer delivery, less disruption during that creation process. So we need to get that balance right. And again, it goes back to a point I made earlier. I'm really keen that we're able to articulate those wider social, economic and environmental benefits that a utopian approach will deliver. So everyone says, my goodness, that's really worth getting. So how do we get there? Rather than perhaps the way some of these individual organisations and interested parties sometimes behave. So I think, you know, we've got to try and get a coalition of people who are asking the question, how can I, rather than a dearth of people saying why you can't. And I think we need to not just think through that technical or through that product lens. We need to also be engaging with planners, with financiers, with insurers, all those sort of areas to make sure we can drive the benefits at the pace and scale that we really need.
So picking up on something you said earlier, Keith, you've referenced Boeing, you referenced the automotive market. I think Bill may have mentioned the Scandinavian design side of things. Do you have any case studies or examples of, whether in construction or from other industries, borrowed from others, where this approach is already yielding the results, that it's working, and where we could potentially take learnings from?
Yeah, so there are a number of areas within the public sector and housing as well where we're seeing some of these solutions being deployed and delivering benefits. I wouldn't yet call them true platform approaches because they're not really fully scalable or fully interoperable, but they're showing a step in the right direction. And that's part of one of the outputs that we produced in the hub alongside the product platform Rulebook, is we created a number of full-scale sandpit structures at the MTC site in Coventry, just to almost prove the process. So we had 3 objectives, Katie, when we put those up. We didn't need to put them up. There was no obligation on us to actually put physical buildings up using kits of parts and modular elements within them. But we wanted to sort of have them there as a tangible asset and learn from them and have them available in the future. And the 3 questions we wanted to really answer were, you know, can it be done? And obviously they're there, so the answer to that is yes. The second question then is, if it can be done, is it worth doing? You know, so in putting them up, we did some measurement on time, on waste, on quality, on speed, on cost, all of those elements to try and compare and contrast what this approach could deliver. Bearing in mind it's a first of a kind, and compare that to a traditional construction process. And we were seeing quite spectacular reductions in waste, quite, really quite jaw-dropping statistics on the time of delivery, the number of vehicle movements associated with it. So we sort of answered the question, yes, it is worth doing. And then really the third question, which is the longer term answer, is having demonstrated it can be done and it's worth doing, how do we use that resource? How do we work with the demand side, on the supply side, all of those stakeholders you refer to try and accelerate and widen the deployment and diffusion of these approaches, because we really believe there's substantive benefits. But just sort of writing a report and publishing it on your website won't move the market. We really have to try and make sure that this resource is understood people understand the benefits of this approach, and then understand what we need to do as individual elements of the supply chain. What do we need to do as manufacturers? What do organisations like BBA need to do to support this market? Where does the insurance market come in? What do clients need to be doing different? How do we work with professional institutions and academia to make sure the right skills are coming through? Because if we really understand and can quantify the benefit of getting to the utopian end state, then that itself will drive, I think, the change. And I want to move the industry away from how it innovates quite a lot at the moment, which is recognizing it does something wrong and trying to do something different without really a clear idea of what the desired end state is. All they know is the current state is undesirable. So if we can sort of get behind a desired end state and really understand the benefits that brings, not just directly within the project, but across those wider indirect economy-wide benefits, then we can plot a path for how we get from where we are today to where we need to be in the future, and really make more of that investment we make each year in the built environment.
Thank you, Keith. Bill, one last question for you before I come back to Keith for final thoughts. Following on from the train of thought around case studies and examples, and looking at other industries who may be from your experience within the civil space, and given that the BBA also looks after or works with the highways and highways areas, manufacturers of products within those spaces. Do you think there is a crossover of this type of approach into, say, that civils market, for example?
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. I think the classic example here, and we can go back in history a little bit with the bridges over the M1 that were built by or designed by Owen Williams back in the early 1960s when that stretch of road was built. They're very iconic, and most people know them, but they're now listed structures. I guess you would say that was more a pattern book design than a true product platform. But it kind of exemplifies the point. Those of you into your bridges, that the design was a kind of a standardized look or feel, but the rules were there according to loading, the width of the road when over the motorway, be that a farm track at the narrowest, or perhaps a dual carriageway main road as the widest, the skew of the bridge, what angle it addressed as it went over the motorway and so forth. And the design, from the concrete outline to all the reinforcement detailing spat out, so to speak, in an automated way, which for its time was a very advanced method of designing. And that consideration continues, and we've got more sophisticated tools now that are involved, and BBA's involved in some project work in that area. So I'm looking forward to that. You look at motorway bridges in general, you will find fairly standardized designs, and indeed it is a very clear component set. Whether I would view that truly as a product platform in the way that is articulated in the rule book, I think, as I said before, it's a kind of ad hoc embracing of the ideas, but it's not fully developed in the meaning of a product platform. So I think with a little bit more work that can be done. Another example I'll draw attention to is High Speed 1, or CTRL as it was. When it was built, there was very much a pattern book approach to that. In fact, the design guide that the Highways Agency put out was modified for CTRL, and the contractors involved used that, and it gave a very clear component set. And again, bridges were a major feature of that. So as a cyclist riding around Kent, where I do, you can always tell when I'm going over HS1 as it now is, because the design of the bridge is one of those particular types of design, and they've served very well over that period. So that's quite a mature railway now. It's a good 30 years old. So yeah, I think there's plenty of scope. We're seeing retaining feature design, retaining structures, those sort of things. There's plenty of opportunity. But I think before I just finish on that point, I think going back perhaps to what Keith was saying about how do we turn some theory into practice here, and this is very much part of what I've spent a lot of my career doing. I think there's a push model that says you should do something, innovate or die sort of approach. Or there's the pull model, making it attractive and actually doing it. One of the difficulties of our industry is this whole approach needs upfront investment in order to get long-term return, whereas the industry actually works on positive cash flow at all times, by and large. But I think the private sector is a good place to start, and I would encourage people to come up with platforms for specific solutions, be that schools, healthcare, might look at commercial industrial and sort of massive shed structures that get put up. low-rise offices would be one, and then residential would be that lower rise or high rise. I'll probably split those two into two different segments. What I would say is I don't think, for my money anyway, the volume, platform's not all about volumetric modules, or are they just all about modularized plant? It's a much more all-embracing concept than that, and it's almost a construct of how you think as just as much as what the solution is, though you will ultimately lead to those sorts of solutions. So what really underlies it for me is around the component set, interfaces and connections, the supply chain manufacturing integration, in the interoperable data that flows through all that and draws it all together. So I think in terms of this practicality point, you need that chain of people, sort of end-to-end supply chain, all gathered, all able to offer a building as an asset, one-off, rather than as a whole set of individual bits, which some main contractor has to assemble on site. And that's really where the difference is coming from. So there's plenty to go at. I think it's a great opportunity, but back to Keith, you're going to give us some final words, I think.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, Keith, back to you for final thoughts. Lots of things discussed today, which in themselves are entire discussion topics. But I wonder if you could just close this discussion for us with your final thoughts and any steps, if people are interested in understanding more, knowing more, what you would advise they do.
Okay, well, thanks, Katie, and thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation with Bill and Andrew, and I think it's probably fair to say it's quite easy to be cynical about what's going to happen next. I mean, we've seen many reports. Andrew mentioned, the slight despair you feel when you look back at all the reports that have been written about how to change and fix the construction industry over the years, and see how little transformation has actually happened in that time. And I have a queue of people who are very keen to tell me that nothing's going to change in the future, and how things and why nothing will happen. And perhaps I have, fortunately, a bigger queue of people who are telling me how it's going to change rather than why it can't. And change is coming. I'm absolutely clear about that. We're seeing new demands on external factors, like building safety, like climate change, like carbon. And we're also seeing some of the technologies around data, digital and manufacturing that are now ripe and ready to work effectively within the built environment. And so I think not only is change coming, I think the business models within the sector and in perhaps some of the players in the sector are going to change. Bill talked about positive cash flow in the construction sector. Well, I don't think big data companies, big tech companies, big manufacturers have that same challenge. If they're seeing the market opportunity for manufactured solutions, they're seeing the power of the data that sits alongside that, on how those elements can be used over 50, 100-year lifespan of a building, then we're going to see, and we're already seeing, some investment coming in from non-traditional construction sector players. So we need to plot a path, if we are striving for this utopian future, that allows in the disruptors and the innovators, and also helps those businesses within the supply chain to develop and grow to meet this new challenge. Designers who have traditionally sold their wares by selling hours, are they going to be moving from a project mindset to a product mindset? Are they going to be investing in developing their own bespoke solution that is then designed once and deployed many? The role of contractors, are they going to be more or less trained assemblers now, where a lot of the purchasing goes through the manufacturers? There are a number of different options for that. We've seen people talking about not selling their products to clients, but leasing them for 50 years, a bit like Rolls-Royce Power by the Hour. So I think there's a number of disruptors that may come to the market, but I'm absolutely clear that change is coming. And I think that utopian end state that platforms and digital and all those external factors can unlock is really worth striving for. And we need to make sure we bring the industry with us and encourage that demand and supply side to work well together, and all those other stakeholders, so we can get there faster, because we need a better built environment. We need to reduce our carbon. We need to reduce the waste we create. We need to improve building safety. We need to deliver more value for money and better services for the citizens of the society. So there's a real opportunity, and I don't want dogma. I don't want can't be bothered. I don't want a list of people telling me why it can't be done. There really is an opportunity, and I think we should be grabbing it. So I really welcome the opportunity to work with people who want to make it happen. And we'll be publishing on our Construction Innovation Hub website over the coming days a few more outputs as our funded programme comes to a close and we move into that phase beyond R&D into deployment and diffusion. And again, the hub itself doesn't want to be, will never be a market player. Our job is to be a market enabler, to help clients and government make better decisions and help industry develop that capability, capacity and appetite so they can respond.
Thank you, Keith. A strong point to end on, and we look forward to seeing what those developments are. And obviously, we're always happy to support wherever we can. So thank you for that. On that note, that brings us to the top of the hour. Thank you, everybody. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will, as I said before, this is available on our website and on our social media. So please feel free to rewatch it and share it with colleagues. Any questions, send them through to hello@bbacerts.co.uk. But from me, Katie Roberts, and all our panelists today, have a wonderful day further, and we'll catch up with you soon.